Hello, welcome to our discussion of Chapter 5. We'll start off by talking about conjunctions and disjunctions. So these are kind of fancy technical words for simpler ideas really than how fancy these words might sound. Well, what a conjunction is that it's a statement that can be put in the following form, A and B. So a conjunction is a statement that contains, you can think of it as containing two statements, really. It contains statement A and statement B. And you can think of a disjunction as a statement that can be put in the following form, A or B. So a conjunction connects two statements with and a disjunction, in a way, connects two statements with the word or. For example, you might say for a conjunction that I like apples and bananas. Disjunction, you might say I like apples or I like bananas. And we can break up disjunctions even further into inclusive versus exclusive disjunctions. An inclusive disjunction are statements that have the form A or B, and in parentheses, or both. So sometimes when we use the word or to connect two statements, we could be saying something like either A could be the case, or B could be the case, or it could be the case that A and B are the case. For example, you might say to someone that you can have lettuce or tomatoes on your sandwich. You might just say, well, yeah, you can have lettuce or tomatoes on your sandwich. Well, when saying that, let's say in this context, you mean that you can have lettuce on your sandwich, you can have tomatoes on your sandwich. If you want, you can also have lettuce and tomatoes on your sandwich. So there are various possibilities here. Three possibilities here with an inclusive disjunction. It's inclusive in the sense that it could be both A and B. That could be the case. It's inclusive. It includes that possibility. An exclusive disjunction excludes that possibility where it's both A and B at the same time. So exclusive disjunctions are statements that have the form A or B, but not both. If you want to think about it in a more formal way, it could read as A is the case or B is the case, and with a tilde there, and it's false that both A and B are true. So, in other words, either A is true or B is true, but not both. That's an exclusive disjunction. Here's an example where an exclusive disjunction is in use. Someone might say this: since you only have $1, on the dollar menu you can have a burger or fries. In this case, you cannot have both a burger and fries because you don't have enough money for it, but you can only have one or the other, but not both. Okay, so let's look at some moves. We've already discussed some moves in regards to disjunctions. Here's the disjunctive syllogism. So this has, the first premise is P is true or Q is true. Second premise says it's false that Q is true. And the conclusion is, therefore, P is true. You might say, on vacation, I'm either going to Paris or I'm going to Qatar. It's false that I'm going to Qatar. Conclusion, therefore, I'm going to Paris. Another move that can be made here using disjuncts is affirming an exclusive disjunct. So when you see these kinds of moves, if you see these kinds of logical structures, these arguments are valid arguments. Right? If the premises are true, the conclusion will be adequately supported. So here, affirming an exclusive disjunct, we're dealing with an exclusive disjunct here in the first premise. Either I'm going to Paris or I'm going to Qatar, but not both. Second premise, I'm going to Paris. Conclusion, therefore I'm not going to Qatar. So as we can see here, both of these kinds of moves, the disjunctive syllogism and affirming an exclusive disjunct, are both valid forms of argumentation. However, here's something where a fallacy could come in play in regards to disjuncts. And this occurs when a premise of an argument with a disjunction, which is an or statement, is false. because there are other alternatives besides the two presented in the premise, or however many are presented in the premise. You might have a premise that is broken up in disjuncts in a kind of triple kind of way, such as I'm either going to Paris or Qatar or to Canada, right? But either way, the fallacy of false dichotomy occurs when a premise of an argument with a disjunction is false because there are other alternatives besides the ones presented in the premise. So, in other words, when the fallacy of false dichotomy is committed, the argument does not pass a true premises test because one of the premises is false because it doesn't include all the relevant alternatives. Although the argument may have proper form, that's always possible, the argument still doesn't work when the argument commits this fallacy. And once again, that's because one of the premises is false. And here's an example of this fallacy in play. The first premise is this: Sheila bought either a sports car or an SUV. Second premise: Sheila did not buy a sports car. Conclusion: therefore, Sheila bought an SUV. Now, if we notice here, this is a form, this uses the disjunctive syllogism. So this passes the proper form test. If you assume that all the premises are true, the conclusion will follow. However, this is not a good argument in this particular case because the first premise doesn't include all the other alternative possibilities. Could be the case that Sheila maybe bought a sedan. Right? There are many other kinds of cars in this instance that Sheila possibly could have bought. So the mere fact that Sheila, you know that in the second premise, let's assuming it's true, that Sheila did not buy a sports car, doesn't mean that you would be warranted in concluding that therefore she bought an SUV. And that's because there's a problem with the first premise. It could be the case that she bought maybe a convertible or a sedan, or what have you. So it could be possible that maybe Sheila bought a sedan rather than an SUV. So we can see here that this conclusion is not warranted. Okay, next let's talk about conditional statements. Conditional is something that asserts that if one statement is true, then another statement is true. In other words, a conditional statement is a fancy word for an if-then statement. If we move to the bottom bullet point there, we can see an example of an if-then statement, or in other words, of a conditional statement. For example, if I win the lottery, then there will be a party at my place. And we can kind of break up a conditional statement into two major parts. The first one is an antecedent. The antecedent is the if statement in a conditional, whereas the consequent is the then statement in a conditional. So in our example, if I win the lottery, that's the antecedent. Then the next part of the conditional, then there will be a party at my place, that's the consequent of the conditional. Once again, these are kind of fancy words for pretty mundane or more ordinary kinds of stuff here. Okay, so let's discuss some fallacies that come into play in regards to conditional statements. One fallacy is the fallacy of denying the antecedent. If you say that the antecedent is false, it does not follow that therefore the consequent is false. If you have as a first premise, if A then B, right, we have a conditional in the first premise. The second premise denies the antecedent and says, well, A is false. You cannot conclude that therefore the consequent is false. To see why this could be the case, here's one example. P1, if I'm driving my new car, then I'm happy. Second premise, I'm not driving my new car. Right? The antecedent is denied here. Conclusion, therefore, I'm not happy. Well, it could be the case that even though I'm not driving my car, maybe I'm happy at the moment. Maybe I'm, for example, watching my favorite movie or eating my favorite food. It could be the case that if you have an argument with this logical form, if A then B, not A, therefore not B, that maybe it works out. But There are cases, as we can clearly see here, where it doesn't work out. Therefore, just in and of itself, given this logical structure, the conclusion does not necessarily follow given the premises, given the truth of the premises. So therefore, the conclusion would not be warranted. Now, of course, if you had as a second premise, if you affirmed the antecedent and had A is true, and then as your conclusion you said, therefore B is true, well, that would be a modus tollens argument, and that would be a valid form of reasoning. Likewise, if you had as the second premise a denial of the consequent, if you said not B, or in other words, B is false, and then in your conclusion you had, therefore, A is false, that also would be a valid form of argumentation. If you assume the premises are true, the conclusion would follow. And remember, that's modus tollens. Okay, so the next fallacy is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. So you cannot construct an argument where you give a conditional, let's say in a premise where you have if A then B, but then in another premise you affirm the consequent, such as you say, well, B is true, and then you conclude that, well, therefore A is true. That is not supported. And to provide a counterexample, and to show you why this is the case, we have here as a first premise, if I'm driving my new car, then I'm happy. So here we have the same first premise as in the previous example. Second premise, we are going to affirm the consequent. We're going to say, I'm happy. Conclusion, therefore, I'm driving my new car. This does not necessarily follow, right? I could be happy, but once again, I'm not necessarily driving my new car. It could be the case that I'm eating my favorite food or watching my favorite movie, etc. Okay, so now we have some problems here, and what you should be thinking about is whether or not what's at play is the fallacy of affirming the consequent, denying the antecedent, fallacy of false dichotomy, or perhaps maybe it's a good argument. So what we have here is, if Vin Diesel is in the movie, then I will go to see it. First premise. Second premise, Vin is in the movie. Conclusion, therefore I'll go to see it. This is a modus ponens form. So we know that this is has a proper form. It has a good structure to it. If A, then B, A, therefore B. So assuming that the premises are true, this is a good argument. Second, the coin flip will land either heads or tails on the concrete floor. Since it landed heads, it wasn't tails. Okay, so what we have here is an exclusive disjunction, right? The coin flip on a concrete floor, when it lands, it will be either one or the other, not both. And here we're going to affirm one of the statements in the disjunct. Right? The coin flip will land either heads or tails on the concrete floor. Then we affirm in the next premise here that it landed heads. The conclusion is it wasn't tails. So this, assuming that the premises are true, is a good argument. Right? So this is affirming an exclusive disjunct, and this is a fine way of reasoning. Okay, so let's move to number 3. When you go to buy a new phone, you can either buy an iPhone or a Galaxy. You didn't buy an iPhone, so now I know that you bought a Galaxy phone. So is there something wrong with this? And when we look at it, it's in the form of a disjunctive syllogism, so it passes the true premises test. However, the problem with it is in regards to the first premise. When you go to buy a new phone, you can either buy an iPhone or a Galaxy phone. There are actually many more different kinds of phones. So this is a false dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy in that there are other alternative options. And if the second premise is true and you didn't buy an iPhone, you cannot therefore conclude that therefore you bought a Galaxy. Right? You would not be warranted in concluding that because there are many other possible phones that this person could have bought. Okay, so Next, let's look at number 4. If I'm drinking water, then I'm doing something that is keeping me alive. As I'm presently doing something that's keeping me alive, I must be drinking water. Is there anything wrong with this? The answer to this is that there is something wrong, and what it's doing is that it's affirming the consequent. Here we have the antecedent. If I'm drinking water, the consequent is then I'm doing something that is keeping me alive. The second premise says I'm presently doing something that's keeping me alive. In other words, it's affirming the consequent. But from affirming the consequent, it is not warranted that the antecedent is therefore true, that I must be drinking water. That doesn't necessarily follow. For example, it could be the case that I'm just merely breathing, right? That's doing something that's keeping me alive. Or it could be the case that I'm eating food. That's doing something that's keeping me alive. I need not necessarily be drinking water. Let's look at number 5. If the Tigers lose 2 regular season games, they will not be in the championship game. Seeing as the Tigers didn't lose 2 such games, the Tigers will be in the championship. Here we have the conclusion that the Tigers will be in the championship, and what precedes that are the premises. Is this a good argument? Well, what we have here in the beginning is that we have a conditional statement. If the Tigers lose 2 regular season games, here's the consequent, they will not be in the championship game. The next premise says that seeing as the Tigers didn't lose 2 of such games, in other words, the antecedent is denied. It's saying that the antecedent is false. It's false that the Tigers lost 2 regular season games. And then what is concluded here is that the Tigers will be in the championship. In other words, the consequent is then denied. The consequent is that they will not be in the championship game. So when you deny the consequent in this case, what will occur is that you have the opposite of it. In other words, the Tigers will be in the championship. But as we discussed on a previous slide, this in itself is a logically fallacious. Right? You cannot deny the antecedent and then receive from that a denial of the consequent. That doesn't necessarily follow. So, for example, in this case, in this kind of college football case, they may not have lost 2 games. Maybe they went undefeated, but in the regular season. But all that means is, let's say in this case, they made it to the playoff, right, where the 4-team playoff, and they may not necessarily make it to the championship game. All right, so that's all I have for you in this lesson, and I will see you for the next lesson.